We are going to resume our series of studies and want to invite you back to Hebrews chapter 12. Since there's been a couple weeks since we were last together, it might be good to revisit these initial verses that kind of served as the springboard and really provides us the concept, the theme here that these series of sermons are all centered around. And as you can see from the board, it's the idea of our enduring to the end. And so as we will come to discover here in just a moment in reading these verses, this idea of enduring to the end comes in the inspired penmans here, picturing living the Christian life as running a race. And as we have given attention to the wonderful analogies and very instructive analogies that we can derive from a physical race, such as might have been run during the Olympic events back then and even currently today, and how some of those things really relate to our running the Christian race, this spiritual race that we are engaged in as Christians. And so here is an appeal, an exhortation for these who had already started the race, but at least were in danger of not finishing it. You know, that's really the context of this entire letter that in the New Testament is identified as the book of Hebrews. It was written to Jewish converts who had begun the Christian race, but because of pressures, they were at least on the verge of not finishing the race. And as we learn from 1 Corinthians chapter 9, friends, there is only one alternative. If you don't complete the Christian race victoriously, if you don't win by crossing the line and in triumph receiving the crown of victory, there's only one alternative. It's to be a reprobate. It's to be rejected. It's to lose. And that corresponds to eternal agony. And so here is that appeal. Endure. Persevere. And a strategy is presented, which really serves as the underlying basis for this series, looking at that strategy. But again, let's read these verses to refresh our minds with regards to the analogy of running the race and to the strategy that is presented for our successfully completing it, enduring, persevering to the end so that we can rejoice in triumph. Wherefore, seeing we also are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us, and let us run. There's the analogy. Let us run with patience. That's one of the needed qualities. That's one of the ideas of endurance. Let us run with patience the race that is set before us. Now here's the strategy that is prescribed. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of the faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross. Jesus endured his race despite the challenges, despite the difficulties, despite the suffering that he had to endure. He endured to the end. Therefore, look to him. Look to him to find motivation, to find reason to endure and persevere in your own running of the race. But again, verse 2, looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. For consider him, Jesus, that endured such contradiction of sinners against himself. Now watch, lest you be wearied and faint in your minds. See, there's part of the analogy. Like running a long-distance race, what can happen to the physical competitors in a long-distance race? They can grow weary. They can faint. Maybe because of injury, maybe just getting winded, maybe it's stumbling, whatever the cause, Similarly, in the spiritual race, the Christian race, there is the potential for growing weary, fainting in our minds, not finishing the race. So, it's an appeal, endure to the finish. That's our objective. Encouraging each of us who are already begun the race to finish. Endure, persevere to the end with the promise of an incorruptible crown. What are we going to have to do that? We're going to have to look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. And so we have asked, kind of setting up for the remainder of the points that make up, our ongoing series, why is that indispensable? What wisdom is there in following this counsel, this prescribed, strategy, looking unto Jesus? Why? Well, first of all, because of who Jesus is. That's how the inspired penman starts here. He is the author and finisher of, again, either the faith or just the concept of faith. Not only that, we also suggested he is the perfect pattern. Not just for running the race, but in every aspect of life. Here's where we interjected 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. For hereunto were you called, because Christ Jesus also suffered for us, notice, leaving us an example that you should follow in his steps. But he was God, right? God in the flesh. We would expect him to provide us a perfect pattern. However, we must also remember he is an empathetic example, because he endured as we do endure. He suffered. He knows what it is like for us to live the human life, to run this Christian race, because he himself did it. And he can empathize with us. He can sympathize with us. I believe even in the song that we just sang, we notice there his being a sympathetic friend. Why should we look to Jesus? Because of who he is. However, it's not enough to know who he is. We have to discover what he did. What he did. And again, I call our attention back to that verse alluded to in 1 Peter chapter 2 and verse 21. Think about the language there that is used. For even hereunto were you called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example. Well, what is an example? Well, there it's a hupogrammos. It's a copy letter at the top of the page. That's perfect. But again, just looking at the letter, if it were that we would just as a student gaze at the letter, does that in any way benefit us substantially? No, we have to make efforts then to follow that example. And so that's what it signifies. It denotes a pattern or a model for imitation. Now I've got to try to, looking at that perfect pattern and appreciating that he's an empathetic example, I now have to try to imitate what he did. And then think about also the idea that we should follow his steps. In the Greek, that word would translate almost like footprints. And again, what does it symbolize? What does that indicate? Jesus is our guide. He's our guide. In other words, he already went before us. He marked out the way. And for me to follow in his steps means I have to again do what he did. It's not enough just to look at him. Again, it's not enough just to say, well, I want to be like Jesus. We have to then make diligent efforts to follow his example. Actually put into practice what he did for us. And again, in the song, he will guide till the day is done. Let him be our guide. He's given us the footprints for us to follow in, but we have to put forth the effort. And so, what did Jesus do? And here we want to enumerate a number of things that we trust has practical application in our efforts to follow Jesus. Looking to Him, yes, as our perfect pattern, as our empathetic example, but with the intent of now truly trying to put into practice what we see Jesus doing that allowed Him to endure, allowed Him to persevere. What was the first thing He did? Friends, He had a proper orientation. That's what we pointed out last week. This idea of orientation is the idea of arranging a compass, if you will, toward a proper direction. That's where the idea orient comes. And we even today use that to designate the eastern countries of our globe. Or it's the idea of adjusting your compass, if you will, to a particular direction. And so then by application in other usages, it is, according to Webster, to adjust with relation to facts or principles. Friends, that's where Jesus began. Jesus established a proper orientation. And we don't want to rehash all that we talked about the last time we were together, but I mean, this is obvious from, the first indication we have of Jesus's, there in Jerusalem at age 12. His parents go looking for Him. When they find Him, He asks them, "Do you not know? Did you not understand? I have to be about my Father's business." Here He is acknowledging that orientation. He knew why He was here on the earth. He adjusted Himself to those facts, those principles. I am here to do my Father's business. And how often do we find then Jesus reiterating that orientation by which He established why He was here? Friends, this orientation now becomes the governing factor, the primary governing factor in the decisions that Jesus made from day to day. He was here, as He would say, to do my Father's will. In the garden, what does He say? If it's possible, Father, let this pass from me, but it's not my will. That's not the orientation. My will is to do my Father's will. I'm here to complete His mission. Friends, that's the orientation we have to have. Early in life, or whatever that speaks to, maybe that's now for some people, but now you have to adopt the proper orientation. You know why we are here on this earth? If you don't, read the book of Ecclesiastes. We are not here to pursue happiness. We are not here for pleasure. We are not here to acquire wealth, to have a family. We are not here primarily for any of those things. We are here to fear God and keep His commandments. Friends, that's the proper perspective. That's the proper orientation that we have to adopt if we are ever going to follow Jesus, do what He did, follow in His footprints, because this is where it began. And every day, we have to, as we find counsel in the epistles written to Christians and congregations of God's people, we have to renew our minds. Renew our minds. How many times are we told to do that? Renew our minds. In what sense? Well, Vines, I thought, had an interesting comment. Quote, he says with regards to this word renew and how it is used as the idea of Christians renewing their minds, quote, the adjustment. You remember what orientation meant? To adjust. The adjustment of the moral and spiritual vision and thinking to the mind of God, which is designed to have a transforming effect upon the life. End of quote. See, that's the idea. Every day, having adopted the proper orientation in our following Jesus, every day we have to renew the mind. Every day we have to calculate, if you will, or calibrate. We have to say, how close are we? Or have we moved off the moral compass? Have we gotten away for why we are here? Have we become distracted from our ultimate purpose? Running the race and finishing it triumphant. All right, well, very quickly, and we'll try to develop this in short order this morning because of the time, but very quickly, Jesus is having established this orientation, this proper orientation, why he was here, necessarily then defined his proper priorities. I mean, that's how his orientation manifested itself in the priorities then that we see Jesus using in making the decisions that he faced daily. Let me ask you, wouldn't you agree? Life is filled with choices. I mean, every day, we probably make how many choices? And choices necessitate or infer what? Decisions. Decisions. That's just part of, the human experience. Daily choices requiring daily decisions. What governs that? What decides what decisions I make? What becomes the factors that are looked at? Well, again, if the proper orientation is doing my Father's will, as Jesus' orientation was, that then became the supreme, the governing factor in the decisions he made. Everyone. And once again, can we not appreciate Jesus being an empathetic example? Inasmuch as he chose to live a human life here, live upon this earth like we do, make an earthly pilgrimage like we do, guess what? Jesus' life was filled with choices, which necessitated Jesus making daily decisions. You know, if that is true of just life in general, what about for those of us who are Christians? Do we as Christians face choices every day? Choices that require decisions to be made. What's going to govern that? Well, again, you look to Jesus and you find Jesus' priorities being dictated by that orientation. I'm here to do my Father's will. And so the decisions I make are always going to have that as my highest priority, doing my Father's will. So let's look quickly at a decision, at a choice, if you will, that Jesus faced right after his being baptized. Look at Matthew chapter 4. What happened to Jesus right after he was baptized? He was tempted. You remember that? 40 days in some wilderness close to maybe the Jordan Valley. Here is Jesus, and he is being tempted by the tempter. Guess what a temptation is? It's a choice. It requires a decision to be made. And again, I want you to think about the dynamics here for Jesus. He hasn't eaten for 40 days. Can you imagine? I cannot. I mean, I can get dizzy if I don't. Some Sundays I do go until night before I eat. And I got to tell you what, come Sunday evening, I mean, I'm just about staggering into my daughter's house and finding out what she got left over from supper. I'm lightheaded, I'm weak. That's a day. Think about 40 days. I cannot even imagine Jesus' physical state. At 40 days, are you even able to stand up? Can you imagine how weak your voice would be? And so here's the tempter. He approaches Jesus, and what's the first choice? If you're the Son of God, you have the ability to turn those stones into bread to sustain your physical hunger. That's a choice. It's a choice that Jesus could have acted on. What does he say? Man does not live by bread alone. And again, I can almost hear his weakened voice. Man does not live by bread alone. Was he hungry? Did his physical body necessitate, sustenance, bread? Yes. But see, that's not the priority by which Jesus was going to make this decision. What does he say? Man does not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God. Where's his mind? Where's his priority? It's back to his orientation. I am here not to satisfy my physical want. That's not why I'm here. I am here to do my Father's will. What he was enduring, obviously, was in harmony with his Father's will. And he was not going to, listen to me, he was not going to sacrifice the spiritual to satisfy the physical. You see that? That's his priority. What was that priority determined by? His orientation. He makes this decision because of his priorities. He was never going to satisfy the physical at the expense of the spiritual. And friends, again, this seems very telling because it's the first choice that Jesus is called upon to make. It's the first decision that we see his priorities governed by that orientation following his baptism. But it's not the only one. Just look at the life of Jesus. All of his choices find him making decisions based on that priority. Let me direct you to another one quickly. Look at Mark chapter 6, please. Mark chapter 6. A number of things are coming together here and make this decision that we're going to see Jesus making all the more profound. A number of things are happening again. Here are Jesus' disciples, his apostles, returning from the limited commission, and he's asking them, for a report. What did you do? What did you see by way of the people's response to your preaching, to your healing? Not only that, but he had just learned that his cousin and his forerunner, John the Baptist, has been beheaded by Herod. And not only that, as we come to learn, look at verse 31. Well, we'll look at verse 30. This is Mark 6, verse 30. And the apostles gathered themselves together unto Jesus, told him all things, both what they had done and what they had taught. And he said to them, come ye yourselves apart into a desert place and rest a while. Do you think they were tired? You think Jesus was tired? Do you think he had a desire to go to his Father in prayerful communion over what has just happened to John and his learning about that? He cared about John, not only because of the physical relationship, but far more because of who he was in relationship to Jesus, his forerunner. So let us come apart. Now watch, he says, for, here's a narrative note by Mark, for there were many coming and going that they had no leisure so much as to eat. Please understand, those are the dynamics. And so Jesus invites his apostles, let's come away from the crowds so that we can get a period of rest, that we can eat and sustain our bodies, that we can kind of revitalize, ready to go again. You might remember they're taking a boat from Capernaum, the western side of the Sea of Galilee, over to the eastern, a more destitute area. And guess what? The people saw him. They're running around on foot. They're running around the Sea of Galilee to meet him on the other side. What does the Bible say? Verse 34, and Jesus, when he came out, saw much people and was moved with compassion toward them, because they were as sheep not having a shepherd, and he began to teach them many things. Why had he gone over there? He had gone over there to remove him and his apostles from the crowds, to give them physical rest, to give them physical food. But when he is faced with a choice, do I tell the people, I'm sorry, we're here for a moment of reprieve? No. What priority do we find Jesus taking? He meets the spiritual needs of the people. Despite his own fatigue, despite his own sorrow and grieving over John, despite his own hunger, he's satisfying the spiritual rather than the physical. You see his priorities? Friends, that was true of every decision that Jesus makes during his earthly sojourn. Why? Because that corresponds to his orientation. I'm here to do my Father's will. That takes priority in my life, in every decision I've got to face. But not only that, when we think about priorities, we also have to factor in time, right? Time. So look at John chapter 4. In John chapter 4, we find, again, an empathetic example. We find Jesus being able to relate to the fact that we have limited time. And so here in John chapter 4, corresponding or in keeping with the healing of the man that was born blind, remember that? But notice what Jesus says by way of a principle. Verse 4, I must work. Now the American Standard Version translates that we. So Jesus isn't just talking about himself, he's including himself with his apostles. We must work the works of him that sent me while it is day. Why, Jesus? The night's coming when no man can work. What is Jesus alluding to? We have limited amount of time. We have limited amount of time to do what we are called upon to do, in keeping with this orientation. So what does that demand? Again, priorities. Priorities. Let me ask you, must you make decisions, must you make choices, or do you face choices every day that call upon how you are going to use your time? And as you face those decisions, does it come to your reasoning, have a limited amount of time? How am I going to use this moment? How am I going to use this hour of my day? Because I have a limited number of them. That's what Jesus is saying. We are here. I am here to do my Father's will. And so here I have a limited amount of time to do it. So I've got to be working toward that. Once again, that's going to dictate Jesus' priorities, how he is going to spend his time. And I'm sure I've shared this one with you because it is so sobering to me. In Mark chapter 1, we find Jesus making one of those decisions, if you will, about how he was going to use his time. And again, giving priority to the spiritual over the physical. In Mark chapter 1, toward the end of the chapter, let me find my verses here. Toward the end of the chapter, we find him healing Peter's mother-in-law. Look at verse 30. But Simon's wife's mother lay sick of a fever, and immediately they tell him of her. He comes in, he miraculously heals her. Right? So he's in the city of Capernaum. Look at verse 32 to give us a setting for time. And at evening, when the sun did set, I don't know what time that is. Let's just say in the fall of the season, 6 o'clock at night? All right. So here we are at Peter's residence, possibly 6 o'clock at night. They brought to Jesus all that were diseased and them that were possessed as devils, and all the city was gathered together at the door. And he healed many that were sick of divers diseases, and cast out many devils, and suffered not the devils to speak, because they knew him. Can you imagine how late into the night Jesus is working? Because I can find no example in the Bible where Jesus just has a group of people and says, you're all healed. He took each one. He met their needs. He cast out demons, many times putting his hands on these people. And here you have the entire city at the door. And he starts at 6 at night. How late did he work? Now verse 35. And in the morning, rising up a great while before day. He went out and departed into a solitary place and there prayed. See, Jesus faces the same kind of restraints that we do. He has a limited number of hours in a day. But Jesus' priority, he made time for the spiritual. And even though he was involved in his Father's work the night before, he made time for prayer and communion with his Father. I find that sobering because I can't tell you how many times I said, well, I would do it if. I can tell you last night I dealt with that. I wanted to continue to study, but you know what? I was tired. And I had a choice to make. And sadly, I made the wrong one, I'm sure. I decided to go to bed before I really wanted to, before I really intended to. Priorities. Jesus made time for spiritual activities amidst his very busy life, amidst the life's demands and responsibilities that he faced. Friends, if we're going to look to Jesus, if we're going to look to him because of what Jesus did, we have to recognize that's going to entail prioritizing our lives. As we run this Christian race, we're going to have to prioritize our lives to coincide with that spiritual orientation that we should have adopted when we became Christians. If we're going to follow him, if we're going to look to him with our ultimate objective and goal to victoriously win the Christian race, it will necessitate our prioritizing time. I meant to spend more time on this than I'm going to. I think I've alluded to it before, but it just made me think about a booklet or a pamphlet that I read about in the past. And it's actually, if you want to look it up online, you can actually download it on PDF file. But it's called The Tyranny of the Urgent. Tyranny of the Urgent. It's written by a Mr. Charles Hummel. A tyranny suggests what? Oppressive power. Another definition that is given that I think it is especially good as it relates to this usage is a rigorous condition imposed by some outside agency or force. Think about that. What is the rigorous condition that is imposed by an outside agency or force? What's the outside agency or force? The urgent. The tyranny, the oppressive power that is imposed on us because of what seems so urgent. Now, here's what Mr. Hummel says as he introduced, our lives leave a trail of unfinished tasks. You got one of those? You got some of those? Unanswered letters, unvisited friends, unread books. They haunt quiet moments when we stop to evaluate what we have accomplished. We desperately need relief. And so he says, well, maybe we're thinking we just need more time. That's just not realistic, is it? God's already set that construct. We get 24 hours a day. Now, we might wish we had 34, but we don't, and we can't. But anyway, so in answering that, listen to his first major division, jumbled priorities. When we stop long enough to think about it, we realize that our dilemma goes deeper than shortage of time. It is basically a problem of priorities. He gives his own anecdotal experience. An experienced factory manager once said to me, quote, "Your greatest danger is letting the urgent things crowd out the important." End of quote. He didn't realize how hard his advice hit. It has often returned to haunt and rebuke me by raising the critical problem of priorities. We live in constant tension between the urgent and the important. And so he goes on to explain the appeal of these demands, that is the urgent, seems irresistible. and they devour our energy. But in the light of eternity, their momentary prominence fades. With a sense of loss, we recall the important tasks that we have shunted aside. We realize that we've become slaves to the tyranny of the urgent. So he asks the question, is there any escape from this pattern of living? Boy, I'd like to know it, right? Guess what he says it is? The answer lies in the life of our Lord. His second major point, his first one was jumbled priorities. The second one is the example of Jesus. You want to get relief from this problem, this tyranny of the urgent? Look to Jesus. Because Jesus helps us understand proper priorities. Priorities that are governed by this proper orientation. Friends, the reality is this: we are living a spiritual race that is being run in a physical realm. With those dynamics, don't you know there's a tug of war constantly going on? Again, as Mr. Hummel presents it, between the urgent, what seems so urgent, and what is truly important in view of eternity. The physical, the spiritual. Friends, this is friction that is going to exist. The Bible speaks of it. Galatians 5 and verse 17. The flesh lusts against the Spirit against the flesh. These are contrary the one to the other, so that we cannot do the things that we would. Peter's writing to Christians, Dearly beloved, I beseech you as strangers and pilgrims, abstain from fleshly lusts, listen to it, which war against the soul. There's this constant battle. And too often, the tyranny of the urgent causes us to make poor decisions because our priorities are out of whack. Have you ever thought about that classic text as it deals with priorities given us by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount? It's interesting. I think Jesus sets forth both proper orientation that leads then to proper priorities. Quickly, just revisit that. Look at Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. Remember how he starts in verse 19? He says, lay not up for yourselves treasures in heaven. Treasures on earth, where moth and rust doth corrupt and where thieves break through and steal. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. What is he trying to help us? Adopt the proper orientation. Where are your treasures? What is most important to you? Because he goes on to explain, verse 21, where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. And then he gives that great example, the eye. You know, if you have a divided eye, your body's going to be full of darkness. If it's diseased, if it doesn't see clearly. And so what do you need? You need this proper orientation. You need this single-mindedness with regards to what is most important in life. And we all know what that is, don't we? Pleasing God, going to heaven one day, finishing the Christian race. That is the most important decision that we're ever going to make in life. I'm sure I've shared this with you, but when I write to my children, when I send them birthday cards, I always put this P.S. I said, don't neglect your soul. One day, it is going to be the only thing that matters. And so when we lose track of that, amidst our busy schedules and things that occupy our thoughts, we're going to make bad decisions. We're going to have jumbled priorities. The urgent is going to replace the important. So Jesus says you got to have the proper orientation, but now watch. That then translates into proper priorities. Therefore, don't take undue thought of what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear, how you're going to live. Don't get distracted even by those essentials of physical life. So what is the proper priority? We all know it, right? Verse 33, seek ye first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. If you do this, He says, all these things shall be added to you. You have a proper orientation that will translate into proper priorities where the spiritual is first. And it will never give way to the physical. Brethren, those are the things we need to look to Jesus to see what He did. You know, there's an occasion in John 6 where Jesus fed the 5,000, once again around the Sea of Galilee. He went this time from the east to the west side, and again, the people were there. They were trying to find Him, and when they find Him, Jesus says, you know why you came searching for me? Because I fed you. And He urges them, don't labor for the food that perishes. See, they had the wrong orientation. Their mind centered primarily on the food that Jesus provided for them, instead of how that sign manifested who He is. He says, don't labor for that. If that's where your primary chief goal is in life, you're going to miss it. He said, rather labor for that bread that doesn't perish. And in that context, He's going to identify Himself. I am the bread of life. I'm the true manna that God has sent from heaven to earth so that you can eat me, you can consume me, the bread of life, and have eternal life. And you know what? You know what's going to happen? Jesus is even going to go on to say, He said, the flesh profits nothing. In comparison, the flesh profits nothing, but the Spirit giveth life. My words are spirit, they are life. And in all of this, you know how it's going to result? Those people with the improper orientation, thinking about the physical rather than the spiritual, they're going to go away from Jesus. They're going to leave Jesus disappointed because He wasn't who they were looking for. What brought on that decision? It was because of a bad orientation, which led to improper priorities. And so I ask us, brethren, have we adopted the orientation that Jesus had? You know why I'm here on the earth? I'm here to do the Father's will. If we live true to that orientation, you know what it's going to bring about? Proper priorities. Like Jesus, I am going to choose always to do that which spiritually benefits me over that which physically might benefit me. Because those decisions are going to have to be made. And we have a limited amount of time. How are we going to spend it? Remember the counsel, redeem the time? The English Standard Version translates that, make the best use of your time. We have a limited amount. That necessitates prioritizing our lives. Now, please, do what I say. Don't do it as I do sometimes. I struggle with this. But that's why we have to look to Jesus. That's my counsel. Look to Jesus. Watch what Jesus did. Look at the priorities that governed His life, that determine His choices in life. Now, you know what all of this is going to require? Great discipline. So next week, we'll transition it. I mean, it's an easy segue, right? Because it's easy to say, I got a proper orientation. That translates into great priorities. And yet, last night, lack of discipline. I'm tired. I'm sitting here on the couch. First of all, that's poor decision, where to try to study on the couch. And before long, lack of discipline finds me failing to act on what I knew was a better priority for how I spent my time. And so, Lord willing, we'll kind of follow this up, because again, if you want to see somebody with just impeccable discipline of life. Look at Jesus. Look at Jesus. That's the kind of discipline Jesus exhibited as he walked this earth. And it all kind of follows from what we've already looked at. So, we're going to sing Tomorrow May Be Too Late. What does that speak to? The need for urgency, right? But this is the right kind of urgency. It's not the tyranny of the urgent versus the important. This is an appeal for us to understand we have a limited amount of time. And we should never count on tomorrow. Remember what Solomon said, boast not tomorrow? You don't know what the day holds. How foolish we would be saying, well, I need to implement this into my life, but yeah, I got some things going on this week, maybe next week. Just don't know when. Tomorrow may never come.